If you've ever stood at the base of Denali, if you've ever looked up at those 20,310 feet of rock and ice rising out of the Alaska wilderness like something from another world, leave a comment and tell me what you felt. That sense of insignificance, that primal understanding that you were looking at something that didn't care whether you lived or died, something that had been standing there for millions of years and would stand there for millions more. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you has been my family's secret for 4 generations. And after what happened last May, I need the world to understand why footprints on Denali only go up, and why we never find the bodies of those who make them. My name is Eric Holmberg. I'm 52 years old, and I've been a park ranger at Denali National Park for 29 years. Before that, I worked as a mountaineering guide, leading expeditions up the highest peak in North America. I've summited Denali 14 times. I've pulled more bodies off that mountain than I care to remember. Climbers who succumbed to altitude sickness, to hypothermia, to the storms that can materialize out of nowhere and turn a clear day into a white-out death trap. I thought I understood this mountain. I thought I knew all the ways it could kill you. I was wrong. There are things on Denali that don't show up in any mountaineering manual. Things that the Koyukon Athabascan people have known about for thousands of years, since long before any white man ever set foot in Alaska. Things that my great-grandfather discovered in 1917, when he was one of the first to attempt a winter ascent of what was then called Mount McKinley. Things that have been taking climbers for over a century, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the snow that go up and up and up, but never come back down. Denali National Park covers over 6 million acres of Alaska wilderness, an area larger than the state of New Hampshire. Most of it is untouched, unmapped, unreachable except by bush plane or weeks of overland travel. The mountain itself dominates the landscape, rising higher above its base than any other mountain on Earth. From the lowlands around Wonder Lake, you're looking at over 18,000 feet of vertical relief, a wall of rock and ice that creates its own weather systems, its own rules, its own reality. The Koyukon called it Denali, the Great One, and they treated it with a reverence that went beyond simple respect for a dangerous peak. They didn't climb it. They didn't hunt on its upper slopes. They left offerings at certain elevations and turned back before reaching the zones they called forbidden. When the first white explorers asked why, the elders would only say that something lived up there. Something that had been there since before the Koyukon arrived. Something that collected the souls of those foolish enough to enter its domain. My great-grandfather, Anders Holmberg, came to Alaska from Norway in 1912. He was a mountaineer, one of the best of his generation, and he'd heard stories about the massive peak in the Alaska Range that dwarfed anything in Europe. He spent 5 years preparing for his attempt, learning the terrain, studying the weather patterns, talking to anyone who would share information about the mountain's moods and dangers. In February of 1917, he set out with a party of 4 other climbers to attempt the first winter ascent of Denali. They were experienced men, well equipped for the brutal conditions that would have killed lesser mountaineers in days, wool layers under canvas shells, the best cold weather gear available at the time, enough food and fuel for a month on the mountain. They made good progress through the first week, establishing camps up the Muldrow Glacier, moving steadily higher despite temperatures that froze their breath into ice crystals before it left their mouths. By day 10, they had established a high camp at 17,000 feet, within striking distance of the summit that no human had ever reached in winter. The wind had been screaming for 2 days straight when they made that camp. Not the worst they'd experienced. Denali could produce winds that would rip tents apart and fling climbers off their feet, but bad enough that they'd spent most of their time huddled in the canvas shelters, melting snow for water and waiting for conditions to improve. Anders wrote in his journal that the wind sounded almost like voices sometimes, like a crowd of people calling from somewhere far above. That's when the footprints appeared. Anders woke on the morning of day 11 to find tracks in the snow outside their tents. Human footprints, barefoot, leading from somewhere below their camp up toward the summit. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night when the temperature had dropped to 60 below zero, and they were absolutely impossible. No human could survive barefoot at 17,000 feet in February. Exposed flesh would freeze solid in minutes, become necrotic within hours. A barefoot person at that altitude in those conditions would be dead before they could walk 100 yards. But there they were. Perfect impressions of human feet, each toe clearly visible in the crystalline snow, walking steadily upward into the killing zone above. The stride was even, unhurried, as if whoever made them had been out for a casual stroll instead of walking through conditions that would kill any living human in minutes. Anders wanted to follow them. His climbing partner, a man named Sullivan, refused. He'd grown up in Fairbanks, heard the Koyukon stories, and he recognized the signs. He told Anders about the collectors, the things that lived in the high places, the beings that the native people had learned to avoid over countless generations. The footprints weren't made by a person, Sullivan said. They were made by something that wanted them to follow, something that fed on the souls of climbers who ventured too high. Anders didn't believe him. He was a rational man, a product of European education and scientific thinking. Ghosts and spirits were superstition, and superstition had no place on a serious mountaineering expedition. He followed the footprints alone. What he found at 19,000 feet changed everything he thought he knew about the world. I have his journal, passed down through 4 generations of Holmbergs, kept in a fireproof safe in my cabin, the pages yellowed and fragile but the words still legible. And the entry from that day is almost unreadable, the handwriting shaking so badly you can barely make out the words. The pen strokes are erratic, pressing too hard in some places and barely touching the paper in others, as if his hand couldn't decide whether to document what he was seeing or throw the journal away and run. He describes figures in the snow, shapes that weren't quite human, that moved against the wind instead of with it, that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like something seen from the corner of your eye. He counted at least a dozen of them, though he admits the number kept changing, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, as if they could split apart and merge together at will. They moved with a grace that nothing living should possess at that altitude, in those conditions where every step should be a battle against gravity and cold and thin air. And he saw faces, faces that he recognized, climbers who had died on the mountain years before, whose bodies had never been recovered, whose disappearances had been blamed on avalanches and crevasses and the 1,000 natural dangers of high-altitude mountaineering. Their features were preserved perfectly in the ice-cold air, not a day older than when they'd vanished, but their eyes were wrong, empty, hungry, looking at him with an attention that had nothing human left in it. One of them smiled. Anders wrote that the smile was the worst part. Worse than the empty eyes, worse than the wrong way they moved, worse than the impossible fact of their existence. The smile was knowing, welcoming, as if they'd been waiting for him to join them. He turned and ran, descended faster than any safe mountaineering practice would allow, half falling, half sliding down slopes that should have killed him, made it back to high camp to find Sullivan and the others gone, their tents still standing, their equipment still packed, their sleeping bags still warm from recently vacated bodies, their footprints leading up the mountain in neat parallel lines toward the summit they had never intended to attempt. Anders called their names until his voice gave out. Searched for any sign of what had happened, any indication of whether they'd left willingly or been taken. He found nothing. Just those footprints, going up and up and up, joining the barefoot tracks that had appeared in the night. Anders was the only survivor. He descended alone, frostbitten and half-mad with grief and terror, and never climbed again. But he didn't leave Alaska. He couldn't. He knew now what was up there, what was taking climbers year after year, what was leaving those impossible barefoot prints in the snow. And he knew that someone had to try to protect the people who would keep coming, keep climbing, keep following those footprints into the domain of things that collected human souls, like trophies. He learned the Koyukon ways, studied with the elders who would speak to him, learned the rituals, the boundaries, the rules that kept the collectors satisfied with their domain instead of descending to hunt in the lowlands where humans made their homes. Rule number 1, never follow barefoot prints in the snow. They're not made by survivors who need rescue. They're invitations, and accepting them means you'll never descend. Rule number 2, above 18,000 feet, never climb alone. The collectors target isolated climbers first. A roped team has a chance, not a good chance, but a chance, of pulling someone back before they're taken. Rule number 3, if a member of your party suddenly wants to leave the tent at night, physically restrain them. The collectors call to people in their sleep. Those who answer the call walk out into the cold and never return. Rule number 4, the summit is forbidden after sunset. Day climbers sometimes make it. Night climbers never do. Whatever lives up there is strongest in the dark. Rule number 5, if you see someone you know is dead, a climber who died years ago, a friend whose body you helped carry down, do not approach them. Do not speak to them. Do not acknowledge that you see them. They're not ghosts. They're lures. Rule number 6, a Holmberg must perform the appeasement at 14,000 feet base camp at the start of every climbing season. The ritual requires blood, breath, and a piece of something precious. Something that represents what you would sacrifice to keep the collectors satisfied with their mountain instead of hungry for the world below. I've followed these rules for 29 years. I've performed the appeasement every May, cutting my palm and breathing words in a language I don't fully understand onto the snow and ice. I've turned back expeditions that didn't feel right, made up stories about weather and crevasse danger to keep climbers away from zones where the collectors were active. I've recovered the bodies of those who didn't listen when there were bodies to recover, and written reports that blamed altitude sickness, equipment failure, anything except the truth. And then, last May, Dr. Catherine Reed arrived at base camp with her research team, her thermal imaging equipment, and her theory about what was really happening to the climbers who disappeared on Denali. And everything my family had protected for 4 generations started to unravel. Dr. Catherine Reed was a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, specializing in cold case investigations in extreme environments. She'd spent her career studying how bodies behaved in Arctic conditions, how they froze, how they were preserved, how the unique chemistry of extreme cold could maintain tissue in ways that seemed almost supernatural. She'd helped close dozens of cases across Alaska, bringing closure to families who had waited years or decades to learn what happened to their loved ones lost in the wilderness. She'd recovered bodies from avalanche debris, from crevasses, from plane crashes in remote valleys where no one had walked since the aircraft went down. She understood death in cold places better than almost anyone alive. And that understanding made the Denali statistics bother her more than they bothered most people. The numbers didn't make sense. Over 130 climbers had died on the mountain since records began, and a significant percentage of those bodies had never been recovered. That wasn't unusual for high-altitude mountaineering. Everest had hundreds of unrecovered dead, bodies that had become landmarks on the climbing routes, too high and too dangerous to retrieve. But the pattern on Denali was different. On Everest, you knew where the bodies were. You could see them, point to them, explain exactly why recovery was impossible. They became part of the mountain's grim geography, warnings to those who came after. On Denali, climbers simply vanished. Their last known positions would be documented, their campsites located, their equipment found still packed and ready. Search teams would be dispatched with dogs and helicopters and every resource the Park Service could muster. And nothing would be found. No bodies, no bones, no clothing torn from frozen limbs, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all, except for one thing: the footprints. Footprints that only went up. "I've analyzed 30 years of search and rescue reports," she told me during our first meeting at the 14,000-foot base camp. She was maybe 45, with the weathered face and capable hands of someone who'd spent decades working in harsh conditions. In 23 cases, nearly 40% of the unrecovered deaths, the last evidence found was a set of tracks leading upward with no corresponding descent. In 8 of those cases, the tracks were described as barefoot. She paused, letting that sink in. Barefoot, Ranger Holmberg. At altitude, in temperatures that would cause tissue death in minutes. How do you explain that? I don't, I said carefully. There are things on this mountain that don't have explanations, things that have been here longer than any of us. The Koyukon knew about them. My family has known about them for over 100 years. The best thing you can do is finish your research at lower elevations and go home. Indigenous knowledge, she said, and unlike some scientists I'd met, there was no dismissiveness in her voice. I've read the ethnographic records, the Koyukon stories about the beings on the mountain, the offerings they made, the zones they wouldn't enter. Most of my colleagues treat that as mythology. I don't. Indigenous peoples don't survive thousands of years in environments like Alaska by believing in things that aren't real. They survive by paying attention to dangers that newcomers don't understand. She leaned forward, her eyes intent. I'm not here to debunk anything, Ranger Holmberg. I'm here because I think something is actually happening on this mountain, something that's been killing climbers for over a century. And I think the Koyukon stories might be the key to understanding it. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to help me investigate before more people die. It was the wrong thing to say. Or maybe the right thing. I've never been sure. Because part of me, the part that had spent 29 years covering up disappearances and performing rituals I didn't fully understand, wanted someone to finally take this seriously. Wanted someone to look at the evidence with scientific eyes and tell me what we were really dealing with. What exactly are you planning to do? I asked. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, night vision cameras at the higher elevations. If something is moving around up there, something that leaves tracks, something that interacts with climbers, then it has to have a physical presence. And if it has a physical presence, we can document it. The collectors aren't physical, I said, and the words came out before I could stop them. Not in any way that cameras can capture. They're something else. Something that exists in the cold and the altitude and the spaces between what we can see and what we can't. Then the cameras will show nothing, and I'll have data proving that the phenomenon isn't explicable through normal means. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. Either way, I learned something. Either way, I'm one step closer to understanding why people keep dying on this mountain and why we keep failing to find their bodies. My son Jakob was 27 that spring, working as a climbing ranger and preparing to take over the family responsibility. He'd grown up with the stories, had sat on my knee as a child while I told him about his great-great-grandfather's expedition in 1917, about the figures in the snow and the footprints that only went up. He'd helped me perform the appeasement since he was 18, standing beside me at 14,000 feet every May, watching me cut my palm and speak the words that Anders had learned from the Koyukon elders. He understood the weight of what we carried, the responsibility that came with being a Holmberg on this mountain. But he'd also inherited my father's curiosity, The same curiosity that had driven Anders Holmberg to follow those footprints in 1917. The same need to understand that had gotten good men killed for over a century. Jakob had studied the family journals the way other young men studied textbooks, cross-referencing sightings, mapping patterns, trying to find some logic in the collector's behavior that might give us an advantage. When he heard about Dr. Reed's research, he wanted to be part of it. I found him in my cabin the night before the expedition, his eyes bright with a determination I recognized all too well. "We've been guarding this mountain for 100 years, he told me, keeping the secret, maintaining the boundaries, performing the rituals. But what if there's a way to actually stop them, to understand what they are and find a way to protect climbers for real, instead of just managing the casualties?" Your great-great-grandfather thought the same thing. He followed those footprints looking for answers. He found something that haunted him until the day he died. He also found a way to keep them contained. The rituals, the rules, the boundaries. Someone had to learn those. Someone had to go into the danger to bring back knowledge. Maybe it's time to learn more. Jacob's jaw set with determination I'd seen in the mirror 1,000 times. "I'm not asking permission, Dad. I'm going. The only question is whether you're coming with me." I should have forbidden him. Should have used my authority as senior ranger, as his father, as the head of the Holmberg bloodline to keep him off the expedition. But I saw too much of myself in his eyes. The need to understand. The refusal to simply accept the darkness without trying to light a candle against it. The same fire that had driven Anders up that mountain in 1917. The same fire that burns in every Holmberg, blessing and curse in equal measure. I let him go. And I went with them, because if my son was walking into the domain of the collectors, I wasn't going to let him walk alone. We established our high research camp at 17,200 feet, the same elevation where Anders Holmberg had seen those barefoot prints over a century ago. The location was deliberate on Dr. Reed's part. Her analysis of disappearance patterns had taken months, correlating data from nearly a century of climbing records, and the results were unmistakable. This was the threshold, the point above which the collectors became active. Below 17,000 feet, deaths followed predictable patterns. Falls into crevasses, exposure in sudden storms, high-altitude pulmonary edema, the medical emergencies that claimed climbers on every major peak. Above it, people simply vanished. There were 6 of us. Dr. Reed, 2 of her graduate students, a young man named Chen, and a woman named Martinez, Jacob, myself, and a climbing guide named Torres who'd spent 15 years on Denali and seen enough strange things to keep an open mind. Torres had been on the mountain when a Japanese climbing team had disappeared in 2015. 4 experienced mountaineers who had radioed their position at 18,000 feet and then simply stopped responding. The search had found their camp, their equipment, their footprints leading up toward the summit. Nothing else. Torres never talked about what he'd seen that day, but he'd agreed to join our expedition without hesitation. We set up thermal cameras covering every approach to our camp, buried motion sensors in the snow in a perimeter 100 yards out, established a rotation so someone was always awake and watching the monitors. The equipment was military grade, capable of detecting a heat signature the size of a human hand from half a mile away. If anything moved near our camp, anything with mass, anything with warmth, we would see it. The first 3 days were quiet. Cold, brutally so. Temperatures dropping to 40 below at night, wind chill pushing it down to 60, 70 below, but quiet. The cameras showed nothing but wind-sculpted snow and the occasional ptarmigan sheltering in the rocks. The motion sensors triggered only for weather events, snowdrifts shifting in the constant wind. Dr. Reed began to worry that the collectors, whatever they were, had somehow sensed our purpose and gone dormant. I almost hoped she was right. Almost hoped we'd spend a week at 17,200 feet and go home with nothing but data proving that nothing unusual existed on this mountain. On the 4th night, the footprints appeared. Torres saw them first, on the thermal cameras. A trail of warm spots in the snow, appearing one after another as we watched, leading from somewhere below our camp toward the summit. They weren't much warmer than the surrounding snow, just enough to register on the sensitive equipment, but they were definitely there. Something was walking past our camp in the darkness, heading up. Dr. Reed grabbed her headlamp and was out of the tent before any of us could stop her. Jacob went after her, and I went after Jacob, leaving Torres and the graduate students to monitor from inside. The wind hit us like a wall of knives. Visibility was maybe 20 feet in the blowing snow, our headlamps creating cones of swirling white that seemed to absorb light rather than project it. But we could see the footprints, fresh ones, perfectly formed, leading up the slope toward the summit. Barefoot. Impossible. And at the edge of our light, just barely visible through the snow, a figure, standing still, facing away from us, as if waiting for us to follow. "Dr. Reed, stop!" I shouted, but the wind tore my words away. She was moving toward the figure, her scientific mind overriding every instinct that should have been screaming at her to run. She had her camera out, was trying to photograph what she was seeing, document the first actual evidence of what had been taking climbers for over a century. The figure turned. I've been on this mountain for 29 years. I've seen deaths that would break most people, recovered bodies in conditions that gave me nightmares for months. But nothing had prepared me for that face. It was Sullivan, Anders Holmberg's climbing partner, the one who had walked up into the snow in 1917 and never returned. I recognized him from the photographs in my great-grandfather's journals. The same broad face, the same distinctive beard, the same pattern of frostbite scars across his cheekbones. He hadn't aged a day in over 100 years. He looked exactly as he had the night he disappeared, except for the eyes. The eyes were wrong, empty, like windows into a darkness that had no bottom. And when he smiled, I saw that his teeth had changed too. Too many of them now, and too sharp, like the mouth of something that had forgotten what human eating was for, and developed new hungers instead, the Sullivan thing said, and its voice was the wind and the cold and the creak of ice under pressure all woven together into something that shouldn't have been able to form words. The bloodline continues, the offerings continue, the blood you spill, the words you speak, the precious things you sacrifice, we accept them all. They keep us patient, content, willing to stay in our high places while you little warm things scurry around on the lowlands below. The smile widened, revealing teeth that had changed too many of them now, and too sharp, like the mouth of something that had forgotten what human eating was for and developed new hungers instead. But you've brought new eyes, new instruments, trying to understand us, trying to shine light into our darkness, trying to reduce us to data points and research papers and scientific understanding. The Sullivan thing laughed, and the sound was avalanches and screaming wind and the crack of ice calving from glaciers. We appreciate the effort. We so rarely get visitors who actually want to see. Most of them just stumble into our domain by accident. Most of them don't even understand what's happening when we take them. But you came looking. You wanted to know. Now you do. More figures emerged from the snow behind it, dozens of them, materializing out of the blowing white like ghosts forming from mist. Climbers from every era. I saw clothing from the 1930s, heavy wool and canvas. From the 1970s, bright synthetic parkas. From last year's season, modern Gore-Tex and down. I recognized faces from missing person reports I'd filed, from search and rescue operations I'd led, from families I'd consoled with lies about avalanches and crevasses and equipment failures. All of them perfectly preserved, not a day older than when they'd vanished. All of them with those same empty eyes and wrong smiles. all of them looking at us with a hunger that transcended anything physical, a hunger for warmth, for life, for the souls that still animated our freezing bodies. "Run," I said, grabbing Jacob with one hand and Dr. Reed with the other. "Run now." We ran, back toward the camp, through snow that seemed to drag at our feet, against wind that pushed us toward the waiting figures instead of away. One of the graduate students, a young man named Chen, had come out of the tent to see what was happening. He stood frozen in his headlamp's beam as the figures flowed past us, around us, converging on him with terrible grace. Jacob tried to go back for him. I had to physically tackle my own son into the snow to stop him. By the time we looked up again, Chen was walking with the figures, joining their procession up the mountain, his face already taking on that empty, hungry look. His footprints joined theirs in the snow, going up, only up. We descended through the night, all safety protocols abandoned in our desperate need to get off that mountain. Torres led, finding the route by instinct and memory, his 20 years of experience the only thing keeping us from walking into a crevasse or off a cliff in the darkness. The remaining graduate student, a woman named Martinez, had gone into shock and had to be short-roped between me and Jacob, her feet moving mechanically while her mind tried to process what she'd witnessed. Dr. Reed was silent for most of the descent. Whatever she'd seen in that figure's face, whatever had registered when she looked into those empty eyes, had shattered something in her scientific worldview. She'd come to Denali looking for evidence of an unusual phenomenon. She'd found something that made phenomenon seem like a child's word for horrors beyond comprehension. We made it to the 14,000-foot base camp by dawn. The appeasement site was there, the flat rock where I'd performed the ritual every spring for 29 years, and without thinking, I went to it. Cut my palm with my knife, let the blood drip onto the snow, spoke the words that my father had taught me, that his father had taught him, that Anders Holmberg had learned from the Koyukon elders a century ago. The wind died. The oppressive sense of being watched, of being hunted, eased slightly. Whatever I'd done, it was enough to convince the collectors that we weren't worth pursuing below their territory. We were leaving their domain. We were no longer their prey. Chen's body was never recovered. His parents were told that he'd fallen into a crevasse during a sudden storm, a tragic accident, the kind that happens every year on Denali. His footprints, going up and never coming down, were erased by the wind before any search team could document them. Dr. Reed returned to Fairbanks and quietly closed her investigation. She never published her findings, never even wrote them up for internal review. When I asked her why, months later, she just looked at me with eyes that had aged a decade in a single night. "I wanted to understand," she said. "I thought understanding would make it less frightening, that science could somehow contain what's up there, explain it, reduce it to data points and research papers." She shook her head. "But some things aren't meant to be understood, Ranger Holmberg. Some things are just meant to be survived. You and your family figured that out 100 years ago. It took me one night." She moved to Arizona the following year, took a position studying prehistoric burial sites in the Sonoran Desert, as far from ice and mountains and the things that lived in them as she could get. I don't blame her. Some knowledge is a burden that not everyone can carry. Jakob stayed. Of course he did. He's a Holmberg, and Holmbergs don't run from their responsibilities, no matter how terrible. But he's different now. More serious. More careful. The easy confidence he used to carry is gone, replaced by a watchfulness that never quite relaxes, a wariness that surfaces whenever he looks up at the mountain. He understands in his bones what I'd tried to tell him in words. The collectors aren't a problem to be solved. They're a force to be managed, contained, appeased. We can't destroy them any more than we could destroy the mountain itself. We can only keep them satisfied with their domain, their summit, their collection of souls that stretches back centuries. He performed the appeasement himself this spring. I watched from a distance, too old now for the altitude, my lungs scarred from too many years in the thin air, my joints aching from decades of cold. He spoke the words perfectly, the same words Anders learned from the Koyukon elders, passed down through 4 generations of Holmbergs like a prayer and a curse. He let his blood fall on the snow, red drops vanishing into white. He offered a piece of his wedding ring. He got married last summer to a woman named Sarah who knows about the family legacy and loves him anyway, who understands that her husband will spend every May bleeding onto the snow at 14,000 feet for as long as he lives. The collectors accepted the offering. I felt it from where I stood at base camp, that subtle easing of pressure, that lifting of the weight that always settled on the mountain when the climbing season approached. The rituals still worked, the boundaries still held. The climbing season opened without incident. So far, 3 climbers have summited successfully this year. 12 more are at high camp, waiting for weather. And somewhere above them, in the endless white of the upper slopes, the collectors are watching, waiting, counting the souls that will eventually join their procession, walking barefoot through the snow toward a summit that no living human has ever really reached. If you ever visit Denali National Park, enjoy the wilderness that we've protected for you. Watch the caribou herds migrate across the tundra in their thousands, following paths they've traveled for tens of thousands of years. See the grizzlies fishing in the rivers where salmon run thick every summer. Watch the wolves hunting in the valleys. Hear them howling at night in a chorus that sounds like the voice of the wilderness itself. Take photos of the mountain from Wonder Lake on a clear day, when the reflection on the still water makes it look like Denali goes down as far as it goes up, a perfect mirror image of the highest peak in North America. Marvel at the northern lights dancing over the peak in winter. Feel the midnight sun on your face in summer. Breathe air that hasn't been polluted by cities or industry, that tastes like snow and pine and the wild edge of the world. But if you climb, if you're one of the 1,000 people each year who attempt to summit the highest peak in North America, who test themselves against one of the most challenging mountains on Earth, respect the boundaries. Listen to your guides when they tell you to turn back, even if the weather looks fine, even if the summit seems close enough to touch. Don't climb at night above 14,000 feet, no matter how good the conditions seem, no matter how much you want to be standing on top of the world when the sun rises. Don't follow tracks that don't make sense, barefoot prints in the snow, paths that seem to lead somewhere you can't quite see. And if you ever see footprints in the snow that are barefoot, that lead up and never down, that seem to be inviting you to follow them toward the summit. Turn around. Descend as fast as you safely can. Don't look back. Don't listen if you hear your name called from somewhere above. Don't stop if you see a face you recognize, a friend or family member or climbing partner who couldn't possibly be there. Just go down and keep going down, and be grateful you made it off the mountain alive. The collectors have been here since before humans came to Alaska. They'll be here long after we're gone. And as long as there's a Holmberg to perform the old rituals, to make the offerings that keep them satisfied with their domain, most climbers will never know how close they came to joining that endless procession up the mountain. But some will. Some always do. Every year, despite our best efforts, despite the warnings and the restrictions and the carefully maintained illusion that Denali is just a mountain, someone follows those footprints. Someone answers the call in their sleep and walks out into the cold. Someone sees a face they recognize. A friend, a family member, a climbing partner who died years ago, and can't resist approaching. Their footprints join the others, going up, only up, forever up, toward a summit that exists somewhere beyond the peak we can see, in a place where the collectors have been gathering souls since before time had a name. That's the truth about Denali. That's the weight my family has carried for 4 generations. And that's why, every spring, a Holmberg bleeds onto the snow and whispers words of appeasement to things that should not exist but do. Some mountains are more than rock and ice. Some peaks are doorways to places we were never meant to go. And Denali, beautiful, deadly, eternal Denali, has been collecting climbers since long before anyone thought to keep count. Trust me, I've spent 52 years learning to read the footprints they leave behind.